Paul Reed thought he was finally winning. He just traded his boring librarian wife for a high-maintenance influencer, and he couldn't stop bragging about the upgrade. But while he was busy mocking her for clipping coupons, he missed the breaking news flashing on the screen behind him. The woman he just dumped was actually a billionaire heiress, and she was about to buy everything he ever loved. Paul leaned back in his chair, a confident smirk glued to his face as he held his phone up for the video call. The restaurant lights reflected perfectly off the giant diamond ring on Brooklyn's finger as she casually adjusted her hair, pretending not to notice how carefully Paul angled the camera. "I traded up, man. Lauren was just starter wife material," Paul said, laughing like he had just delivered the smartest line in the world. On the other end, his friend chuckled, though it sounded forced. But Paul didn't care. In his mind, he had already stepped into a new life. A better life. A bigger life. One where he was no longer tied to someone who made everything feel small. Brooklyn leaned in closer to him, her perfume strong, her smile camera ready. "Make sure you get the ring," she whispered, though the microphone definitely picked it up. Paul grinned wider. "Oh, don't worry. Everyone's gonna see it." He truly believed that moment said everything about him, his success, his taste, his future. Across the room, a television flickered quietly above the bar. A news anchor spoke with urgency about a major announcement, something about an heiress finally stepping into public view after years of privacy. The name Harris scrolled across the screen in bold letters. But Paul never turned around. To him, Lauren was already part of the past. Lauren, with her oversized sweaters and quiet habits. Lauren, who spent evenings reading instead of attending events. Lauren, who preferred saving money over spending it. To Paul, she had been dead weight. He remembered how she used to sit at their tiny kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of books, carefully making notes in the margins. The table had one uneven leg, and it would wobble slightly whenever she leaned too hard on it. He used to joke about it. "Maybe one day we'll upgrade, huh?" he would say. Lauren would just smile and reply softly, "It works for now." That answer used to annoy him. Everything about her felt like, for now. For now we save. For now we stay here. For now we keep things simple. Paul didn't want for now. He wanted now. Big, loud, impressive now. And Brooklyn? Brooklyn was exactly that. She didn't talk about saving. She talked about investing in appearance. She didn't think about quiet nights. She thought about content. Every moment was an opportunity. Every place a backdrop. "This isn't just a wedding," Brooklyn said one evening as they sat together scrolling through venues. "It's a statement." Paul nodded, completely pulled into her world. "I want drone shots," she continued. "Fireworks. A custom hashtag. And the venue has to be perfect. Not just pretty, iconic." She paused, then tapped her screen. "There," she said. "Lakeshore Manor." Paul looked at the photos. The place was breathtaking. Huge gardens, sparkling fountains, grand halls that looked like they belonged in a movie. It also looked expensive. Very expensive. But instead of hesitation, Paul felt excitement. "That's it," he said. "We'll book it." Brooklyn smiled like she had just won something. In that moment, Paul felt like he had finally aligned himself with the life he deserved. A life where nothing was out of reach. A life where he wasn't held back by someone who thought small. Meanwhile, Lauren sat alone in her quiet apartment, closing a book gently as her phone buzzed on the table beside her. She stared at the screen for a moment before picking it up. The message was simple. "It's time." Lauren exhaled slowly, her calm expression hiding something much deeper. For years she had chosen this life. A smaller life. A quieter life. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She had wanted to know what it felt like to be loved without conditions. Without expectations tied to her name. Without people seeing her as an opportunity. So she became Lauren. Just Lauren. No last name that opened doors. No wealth that changed how people treated her. And for a while she thought she had found something real. She thought Paul loved her. But in the end he didn't leave because of hardship. He left because he believed he deserved more. Lauren didn't cry when he walked away. She didn't beg. She didn't try to explain. Instead, she simply let him go. And now, sitting in that same quiet room, she realized something important. She had her answer. Slowly, Lauren stood up and walked to the window. The city lights stretched endlessly in front of her, glowing like possibilities waiting to be claimed. She picked up her phone again and made a call. Her voice when she spoke was calm and steady. "I'm ready," she said. There was no hesitation anymore. No pretending. No holding back. The version of her that lived small on purpose was gone. And in her place stood someone who no longer needed to hide. Back at the restaurant, Paul raised his glass, completely unaware of the shift that had just begun. "To the future," he said proudly. Brooklyn clinked her glass against his. "To the life we deserve." Paul smiled, believing every word. But somewhere far beyond that moment, beyond the lights, the laughter, and the illusion, something much bigger had already started moving. And Paul Reed had no idea that the life he was celebrating was already beginning to fall apart. The weeks leading up to the wedding felt like a dream to Paul. Everything was moving fast, faster than he had ever lived before, and he loved it. Every day brought something new to show off. A new expense, a new upgrade, a new way to prove not just to others but to himself that he had made the right choice. Brooklyn documented everything, from cake tastings to outfit fittings, from venue visits to late-night planning sessions that were really just photo shoots. Every moment was turned into content. "People are obsessed with this," she said one evening, scrolling through her phone with a satisfied smile. "This wedding is already trending." Paul leaned over her shoulder, watching the likes and comments pile up. "Wait till they see the actual event," he said. "This is just the beginning." He believed that. To him, this wedding wasn't just a celebration, it was a launch. A statement to the world that Paul Reed had arrived. But behind the scenes, things weren't as perfect as they looked. Bills were stacking up faster than he expected. The deposits alone had drained most of his savings. The rest went onto credit cards. First, he told himself it didn't matter. This was an investment. Once people saw this lifestyle, once his connections grew, once his career took off, it would all come back 10 times over. That's what he kept repeating. At work, Paul carried that same energy. He walked into the office like he already owned the place, speaking in bigger terms, making bolder claims. He started dropping hints about promotions, about leadership roles, about his vision for the future of the company. Westbridge Capital had always been competitive, but Paul now treated it like a stepping stone instead of a destination. "I'm thinking long-term," he told a colleague one afternoon. "This place is just part of the journey." His colleague raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" Paul smirked. "I don't plan on staying small forever." What Paul didn't know was that the company itself was changing. Quietly, carefully, behind closed doors, conversations were happening at levels he had never reached. Decisions were being made that would reshape everything. And at the center of those decisions was Lauren. Now known by her full name, Lauren Hart. She had stepped fully into her role. The boardroom she now sat in was nothing like her old apartment. There were no wobbly tables here. No second-hand chairs. Everything was polished, precise, intentional. But Lauren herself hadn't changed in the ways that mattered. She still listened more than she spoke. She still observed every detail. And she still valued clarity above everything else. "Westbridge Capital is undervalued," one executive said, pointing to a series of charts. "With the right restructuring, it could become highly profitable." Lauren nodded slightly, her eyes scanning the data. "And the leadership?" she asked calmly. "There's potential," another voice replied carefully. "But there are inefficiencies. Some individuals are overestimating their value." Lauren didn't react outwardly, but she understood exactly what that meant. She had seen it before. People who mistook confidence for capability. People who believed they were bigger than the systems supporting them. People like Paul. For a brief moment, a memory crossed her mind. Paul standing in their old kitchen, talking about how he deserved more, how he was meant for something greater. At the time, she had wondered if he was right. Now she simply saw the truth. "Proceed," Lauren said softly. That one word set everything in motion. Back in Paul's world, the only thing that mattered was the wedding. Lakeshore Manor looked even more stunning in person than it did in the photos. The gardens were perfectly maintained, the fountain sparkled under the sunlight, and the grand hall felt like something out of a fantasy. "This is it," Brooklyn said, spinning slowly as if she were already imagining the cameras capturing her from every angle. "This is where everything changes." Paul wrapped an arm around her. "Best decision we ever made." But even in that moment, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. Then it buzzed again. And again. Finally, slightly annoyed, he pulled it out and glanced at the screen. Emails. Multiple emails. Work-related. He frowned but quickly locked the screen. "It can wait," he said, forcing a smile. Brooklyn didn't even notice. She was too busy directing a short video clip, adjusting her pose near the fountain. "Can you stand over there?" she called out to Paul. "I need a candid shot." Paul moved into position, pushing everything else out of his mind. Work could wait. Reality could wait. This moment, this image was what mattered. Meanwhile, Lauren stood in front of a floor-to-ceiling window in her office, looking out over the city. Her phone rested quietly in her hand as reports continued to come in. Every step of the acquisition was unfolding exactly as planned. Every signature, every approval, every calculated move was bringing her closer to full control of Westbridge Capital. She didn't feel excitement. She didn't feel revenge. What she felt was resolution. Not just about the company, but about her past. She had spent years protecting people from the truth of who she was, softening her presence, making herself smaller so others could feel bigger. And where had that led her? To being underestimated, to being left behind, to being seen as replaceable. Lauren's grip on her phone tightened slightly, not in anger but in understanding. "No more," she whispered to herself. Back at the venue, Paul and Brooklyn stood at the center of the grand hall, imagining the wedding day. "The lights will be here," Brooklyn said, pointing upward. "And the screens will be there. I want a highlight reel playing during the reception." Paul nodded along, though a small part of him was starting to feel the weight of it all. "Are we maybe going a little over budget?" he asked carefully. Brooklyn turned to him, her expression shifting just slightly. "This isn't the time to think small, Paul," she said. "This is our moment." Paul hesitated. Then he smiled again, pushing the doubt away. "You're right," he said, because admitting otherwise would mean admitting something he wasn't ready to face. That everything he had built this new life on was far more fragile than it looked. And as the sun began to set over Lakeshore Manor, casting long shadows across the perfect landscape, two very different paths continued moving toward the same inevitable collision. One built on illusion, the other built on truth. And soon there would be no way to separate them. The day of the wedding arrived like a perfectly staged dream. Lakeshore Manor looked exactly the way Brooklyn had imagined it, maybe even better. The gardens were glowing under soft golden light, the fountain shimmered, and every detail was carefully arranged to look effortless, even though it had taken months of planning. Guests arrived dressed in expensive outfits, cameras flashed, and soft music floated through the air. Everything felt perfect. Paul stood near the entrance, adjusting his suit for the 100th time. His reflection in the glass doors looked like the man he always believed he could become. Confident, successful, admired. "This is it," he whispered to himself. Across the venue, Brooklyn was surrounded by a small group of people, all focused on her. Hair, makeup, angles, lighting. Everything had to be flawless. "Remember," she said to the videographer, "I want the entrance to feel cinematic. Slow motion, wide shot, then close up." She smiled at her reflection. "This is going to break the internet." And for a while it felt like it might. The ceremony began beautifully. Paul stood at the front, watching Brooklyn walk toward him. Every step perfectly timed, every movement designed for attention. Guests watched in awe. Phones recorded every second. Paul felt proud. This was his moment, his life, his story. And finally, everything was exactly the way he wanted it. But perfection doesn't usually last long when it's built on something unstable. The first sign was small. At the reception, just as the guests began enjoying themselves, one of the staff members quietly approached the event coordinator. There was a brief, tense conversation. Then another staff member joined. Then another. Paul didn't notice at first. He was too busy laughing, shaking hands, soaking in the attention. But then Brooklyn's smile faltered slightly as she noticed the bar area. The drinks had stopped. Guests were starting to whisper. "What's going on?" someone asked. Within minutes, the music cut out. The entire room shifted. Confusion replaced excitement. Paul frowned, looking around. Why did the music stop? Before anyone could answer, the large screens, meant to display Brooklyn's curated wedding content, suddenly flickered. For a brief second, there was nothing but static. Then the image changed. A news broadcast filled the screens. The room fell silent. "Breaking news," the anchor said. "Hart Morgan Holdings has officially completed its acquisition of Westbridge Capital. The new chairwoman, Lauren Hart, is expected to implement immediate structural changes within the company." The name hit him like a shockwave. Lauren Hart. No, it couldn't be. But then her face appeared on the screen. Calm, confident, unrecognizable, and yet completely familiar. The same woman he had dismissed. The same woman he had left behind. Only now she wasn't small anymore. She wasn't quiet. She wasn't for now. She was everything. The room erupted into murmurs. Guests turned to look at Paul, then back at the screen, then at Paul again. Brooklyn slowly stepped away from him, her expression no longer supportive, just calculating. Paul's phone began to buzz violently in his pocket. He pulled it out with shaking hands. Email after email flooded his screen. One stood out. HR notification. He opened it. His eyes scanned the words once. Then again. Position eliminated. Just like that. Everything he had been building toward, everything he thought was secure, was gone. Right there, in the middle of his own wedding. A staff member approached him hesitantly and handed him a small envelope. "For you, sir," they said quietly. Paul stared at it for a moment before opening it. Inside was a single note. His hands trembled as he read it. "You always said you wanted a night people would never forget. Now you have it." No signature. But he didn't need one. Paul looked up at the screen again, at Lauren, no, at the person she truly was. And for the first time he understood. This wasn't revenge. This was consequence. Around him, the wedding continued to fall apart. Guests started leaving. Conversations turned into gossip. Phones captured everything. Not the perfect moments Brooklyn had planned, but the chaos she couldn't control. Within hours, clips from the disaster began spreading online. The man who dumped a billionaire. The wedding that collapsed in real time. Paul had wanted attention. Now he had it. Just not in the way he expected. Brooklyn didn't stay long. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She simply walked up to Paul, looked at him one last time and said, "This isn't the life I signed up for." Then she left. Just like that. No drama. No hesitation. Only distance. By the end of the night, Paul stood alone in a venue that was never truly his. The lights felt colder now. The silence heavier. Everything that once looked like success now felt empty. And there was no one left to blame but himself. 1 year later, the world looked very different. The viral moment had faded, replaced by newer stories, newer scandals, newer distractions. But for Paul, the consequences stayed. Every single day. He stood behind a sink in a small 24-hour diner, his hands red and rough from constant work. The sound of running water filled the quiet space as he scrubbed dishes, one after another. There were no cameras here. No applause. No audience. Just reality. Sometimes, he would catch his reflection in the metal surface in front of him, and for a moment he wouldn't recognize the person staring back. The confidence was gone. The arrogance was gone. All that remained was understanding. He had traded something real for something that only looked real. And in the end he lost both. Across the city, in a high-rise office filled with light, Lauren stood once again by a window. The same calm presence, the same quiet strength. But now she wasn't holding herself back anymore. She had stepped fully into her life on her own terms, not to prove anything to anyone, not to get even, but simply because she no longer needed to hide. She had learned what she needed to learn, and she had moved forward, without anger, without regret, just clarity, because real power doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't need attention. It doesn't need validation. And karma doesn't rush. It doesn't forget. It waits. And when it arrives, it makes sure the lesson is never forgotten.